All right, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are today, and welcome. I'm so thrilled that you are joining us for today's webinar as we hear from four awesome panelists about creativity and experimentation that leads towards innovation. I want to first acknowledge our sponsor and funder for today, the Bossier Parish Community College, and Monica Lawrence. Hi, Monica, who received a grant for some women in STEM programming, and we are thrilled to support BIPC and the Center for Teaching and Learning in providing these resources. My name is Megan Pollock, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And I'm also the founder of Engineer Inclusion. And so I am based in a small town in Southeast Texas. And my company, Engineer Inclusion, we get to provide services, tools, and resources to organizations and companies and institutions across the globe, helping them to intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organizations. I'm particularly excited about this conversation because I too am a woman in STEM. My background is in computer science and engineering, and my work has focused on creating STEM environments where women and people of color and people from other traditionally marginalized groups feel valued, included, and affirmed, and have dedicated my life and work towards that. I want to also introduce to you our support today. That's going to be Elizabeth Johnson, and she is she's not the founder of Engineer Inclusion, she's my communications manager, but she is going to be in the background today supporting you and getting you what you need and reminding you in the chat how you can best participate with us. Now I want to introduce you to our panelists. So first up is Dr. Chanel Beebe. Chanel is from the bustling streets of Detroit to the forefront of STEAM education. This is Dr. Chanel Beebe. She is an engineer turned socio-technical activist who's engineering a better world through creativity and equity. Founder of Beebe Arts LLC, she's not just shaping the future, she's redesigning it. Next is Dr. Joanna Nelson, an ecologist with a mission from the headwaters to the sea. At the helm of Land Sea Science and championing conservation with the Save the Redwoods League, she's not just studying the environment, she's fighting for it. With Indigenous communities by her side, she's lighting the path for stewardship with science and soul. Next is Dr. Fantasy Nicole, a powerhouse of innovation and a champion for equitable learning. With a quartet of engineering degrees and a heart firmly rooted in community, she's transforming the educational landscape one data point at a time. So get ready to be inspired by a leader who's redefining what it means to learn and grow. And last but not least, please welcome Dr. Pamela Leggett Robinson, a trailblazer in STEM education and the mastermind behind PLR Consulting. With over 2 decades in academia and a knack for unlocking federal funds, she's not just breaking barriers, she's building bridges. From Atlanta to the Academy, she is paving the way for equity in STEM. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an agenda and what to expect today. So we've got our introduction, so just cleared that out. I'm going to have a pretty good chunk of our time today dedicated to questions for the panelists. And so we've also got a few Slido polls for audience engagement, and we hope that you'll be able to participate with us today. Towards the end of the hour, we'll save time for audience questions that we're going to invite you to submit using Slido. And then using Slido, you can vote on that. And then we'll end at the end of the hour with some sort of action items and next step. So if you're not familiar with Slido, you can use a smartphone or you can go to the web address shown in a second. Same QR code throughout the day. So with that, let's get started. Now, my first question for each of the panelists, not everybody's going to answer every question, but this one I do want them to. And we also want to invite you, our guests, our participants, to answer this question as well. So my first question is to define what creativity means to you. So for me, creativity means freedom and flexibility to express myself and my ideas in meaningful ways. So let's start with Chanel. Chanel, why don't you tell us first what creativity means to you?
So I'm an artist. I was born and raised as somebody who's already always been creative. But over time, it's evolved. So creativity to me is a form of expression. It's also a form of liberation. So I found creativity to be a way of liberating my own ideas and my own self out of my own head, but also a way of communicating the world I like to see, just to my environment. So creativity is like one of my key values and the key way that I engage in this world. It's also been my saving grace a lot of times. there have been experiences and things that I couldn't unpack verbally to my community, to my therapist. But with some type of creativity, be it painting, poetry, or just talking, like I consider the vent sessions I have with my colleagues as creativity because I'm finding ways to give words to things that have been nuanced. Those have been things that have really saved my life and then oftentimes just allowed me to be transitioned. So I'll say the short version, creativity is a form of liberation to me.
I love that. Thanks so much, Chanel. Um, Now, Joanna, what about you?
I'm really enjoying Chanel's answer. And for me, creativity is about, tapping into either being still or just the something bigger. And I really love the transition from into making something. So, right, in some ways it's obvious, in others, like there was no written piece, there was no art piece, there was no figure it out, and now there is. So that landing it into the world is really exciting for me and a really wonderful process.
Thanks, Joanna. And Fantasy, what about you? What does creativity mean to you?
Okay, so for me, it is creativity is taking an intangible fantasy, right? Because I got to use my name. It's taking an intangible fantasy, integrating it with your passions and skills, and then actually birthing it into your current reality to address a problem, like, but in your own way, right? Because I feel like we all kind of experience the same problems, but we experience it in different ways. And so our creativity, the things that we fantasize about solving that problem is what's actually going to allow us to be able to address it.
Thanks. And Pamela, what about you? What does creativity mean to you?
Just the ability to learn and grow as space and time permits. No constraints. The ability to process just wherever I am, the ability to think wherever I am, and think about whatever it is I want to think about. Like there's no holds barred. Like if I want to think about chemistry from a perspective of a plant, then that's good. But if I also want to think about chemistry in terms of the color lipstick that I put on, then that's good too. So any way that I can use chemistry to think and grow and learn and just create, that's what I think about creativity.
Thanks so much. So we've got some participation from the audience, and some people have said that creativity means to them the ability to express themselves free of judgment, to problem solve and entrepreneurship, allowing the exploration of ideas, or taking a situation, a problem, or an area of interest and exploring it with freedom to express new ideas, combine media, and interact with others in various environments. And finally, feeling inspired and acting on it. I like all of these definitions, and I think the last one about feeling inspired and acting on it, I think, is a really beautiful sort of way of framing creativity as well. So thanks, audience, for your participation. Oh, we got another one. Creativity is allowing yourself to think freely. Well, again, thank you for your contributions. We're going to switch now to talking about what does this look like in the STEM workforce. And so I want to point this first to Chanel. So she's recently come from working with Ford Motors and their design space. And so I want to ask you, Chanel, in what ways do you find that your field of profession depends on creativity? And could you provide an example of how it's played a role in your work?
Yeah, I love this question. So in every role that I have, usually the biggest piece of feedback I get is about my creativity. And creativity doesn't manifest in the way that you would think. For me, like yes, I am an artist, but my role in these organizations is not necessarily to be creating like visual art. My creativity usually manifests in the methods I use and the way that I engage with our clients and our stakeholders. And in a lot of ways, that's been the thing that I think has propelled me into my career thus far, but also that has differentiated me and kind of insulated me from how the industry has evolved. So in my work at Ford, it showed up in a lot of different ways. Really, it's been, how well can I translate what I know about my lived environment and what I know about different populations into the decisions we make about how we engage these people. So thinking about, designing research studies or designing things that, our external partners or our customers see, how human can I make these things and what can I do to bring that human component in a way that is still time effective and cost effective for the organization. So creativity has just allowed me to be able to do some new and innovative things, to do some like new remixes of old methods, but also to make sure that when we're engaging with our client base, that we're doing so in a way that's memorable and that's engaging. I've since left Ford, or was nicely asked to leave. We had a round of layoffs. So for me, creativity since then has been in how do I leverage my skills, right? How do I transition my career? And I've been able to be super creative in the way that I describe what I'm doing, the way that I describe my offerings, which has allowed me to continue working for myself and really not miss a beat in terms of how I'm able to take care of myself. And that's required me to translate these very corporate, sometimes very academic skill sets and focuses into things that nonprofits and people I care about can actually relate to. And that's been my goal, even when I was in grad school. Fantasy can attest to that. I've always been like doing what needs to be done in a creative way, mostly because I'm from a generation that does not believe in these systems, but also I'm from a city that's experienced bankruptcy, right? And when you see a city municipality become bankrupt, what it embeds in you is that you need to be real creative about how you're going to take care of yourself and what this is going to look like. And that's required me to have interesting relationships with my organizations and with my clients, but also always being ready to pivot and always being ready to do something new and something different. I'm sorry, I'm gonna try to be less wordy with my response, but I love this topic, Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Chanel. And for our audience, something that's unique between the panelists here is all of us, all five of us, are people who have STEM backgrounds and have used those in really creative ways to build businesses. And I think that that's a great testament to this sort of skill of how we leverage our own lived experiences within the discipline to create and sort of pave our own ways. So let me turn to Pamela. So Pamela, you have a unique sort of background coming from a couple of decades in academia as a professor. So tell us a little bit about what creativity might have meant for you and how you were teaching students, and how that played a role in your work and what you were teaching your students to learn and do as well.
That's a really good question, Megan, because when I was in higher ed, I served as a department chair. So there was always some new and creative idea that we were trying to get funding for. But more so, I taught organic chemistry. And as most people, it is dead. Like it is probably the deadest chemistry known to man. That no one does anything new in organic chemistry that they want to teach undergraduates. So bringing a level of creativity to the class to make it fun and exciting was one of the things that I actually enjoyed about teaching. Um, I brought in applications, ways in which organic chemistry was used in our hair, in our clothing. And because I taught undergraduates, I hate to say this, in some of the beverages that they drink, so we would talk about alcohol and those sorts of things. And so that was a way to engage students creatively. And then we did synthesis problems. And I love those too, because it allowed students to think about a mechanism and a reaction scheme in a way that best fits the way they think. And so taking those skills and being able to leverage those, as Chanel mentioned, to a business was very exciting for me. So even as I think of myself and know that I am a consultant, I have my own business, I think of myself as a chemical reactor. And so I am that reagent that transforms that reactor to the product. And because, like I said, my background is physical organic chemistry, not to bore you with that methyldoxyramine, da 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 da. But I think of myself as like a little reagent, and I can do all types of synthesis. And so that's one of the ways I think my creativity shows up as a consultant, and then as an evaluator. Although I work with institutions and organizations, and evaluation doesn't change. So let me just say that out loud in the universe. It is the same. You are evaluating a program. Does it work or does it not? That's it. At the end of the day. But how you evaluate the program is where the creativity comes in. And you have to look at organizations as reactants. And then you come in and you look at what the environment is and you create something that's beautiful, something that's new. So even though your outcome says that this worked or it didn't, it's the ways in which that reaction, that mechanism takes place that makes it amazing. There's no boilerplate. I look at every client as a whole different being. And I tailor the evaluation to them so that at the end of the day, they can be proud of the product that they get as a new product, if you will, in chemistry.
Yeah, so some commonalities I hear and what Pamela, what you're saying, and Chanel, what you're saying is this sort of humanity and creativity and listening. So I want to pivot those sort of thoughts to Joanna, who I think also is doing really, really unique work around conservation and the environment. So how do you sort of leverage listening and the human part of this in your work as it relates to creativity within your profession?
Thank you. Listening is really important in my work, connecting Indigenous knowledges and Western science, and I'm non-Indigenous. And we have a history of genocide in the now United States. So there's a lot of harm to come back from, with multiple communities right now, just Indigenous communities, and a lot of assumption that Western science is the only way to know things has been, and a lot of, for me, strange ways of looking, so 2020, it's all over the major newspapers. I'm glad about that, of like, we have all these wildfire problems and maybe Indigenous people have the answer. And so that weird grabbing people from the margins and sticking them in the spotlight, and then how long is that going to last before people get dropped again? So it really matters to me, continuity and connection and community, and that respect, and figuring out how to have multiple ways of knowing things and going forward with equity, because you keep working it out and keep working it out, right? Coming in with respect and good agreements, and then needing to keep going as you find out where your blind spots are, Achilles heels of like, oh, I don't know how to do this well. So in this creativity question, my profession depends on creativity because there are so many places we see that we're stuck, right? I work on climate action. Oh, we have a problem. We need to get unstuck and do something different. And, especially in the US West and everywhere, we have increasing wildfire problems that come from federal policies of there will be no fire, instead of 10,000 years of cultural burning by Indigenous nations. So we have those places where we know what doesn't work, right? We're really stuck and we gotta try something else. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joanna. So creativity really is the answer. So let's turn now to fantasy for the next question. So my next question for fantasy is, can you share a time when experimentation led to an unexpected but valuable outcome in your project or research?
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. I will say so I actually just graduated with my PhD in May of 2023 in engineering education systems and design. Because it is still a developing field, I was actually able to really tap into my creativity, and I love rapping, I love writing stories, poetry, all of those things. So when I was doing my dissertation research, I decided that I was going to use art as a way to collect data. Now, originally, it was just to understand, okay, what are the spirit murdering experiences of Black women in engineering doctorate programs? And so, of course, we say we're going to use this to collect this data. It's not, that is the purpose. The purpose was, okay, y'all draw this art piece that represents spirit murdering so that I can understand what spirit murdering looks like. However, when I was having conversations, our interviews, I called them homegirl conversations, because I called my participants my homegirls, aka my intellectual contributors, because we can't do research without them, right? So I think we should probably give them a better name than just being participants for me. But I would say that when I was talking to my homegirls, they were talking about how the art actually allowed them to continue to reflect on that moment in different ways. So I think of it as holding a gem or a jewel, and the light is shining through it and you see it in a different way every single time. And so I was like, oh, like, so this actually has like some healing modalities in it because it's art, it's reflective, and it's all of these other things. So it actually made me choose to embed art in my research and stuff moving forward. Originally, I wasn't going to do it. It was just kind of something that I wanted to do different for my dissertation because it's like an arts-based engineering dissertation, really. But, you know, because I was actually able to say, like, my homegirls were like, no, this is actually healing to me. Like, I didn't see it this way. This is almost there. This is very therapeutic. It actually encouraged me to make sure that I even embedded some type of healing activities or therapeutic activities when I do conduct this research because it can be heavy. You know, when you're creating, when you're being in STEM, when you're the only one, when you're, you know, all of these things. And so just, you know, it went from me just needing to do a means to an end, right? Like me just needing the actual data to me being like, okay, now I actually want to embed healing practices into my research.
Yeah, thanks so much, Fantasy. So, you used a term that I bet some people on this webinar don't know what that means, and that's spirit murdering. So, why don't you give us your definition of that and why you thought it was important for you to study that?
Okay, spirit murdering is in its simplest form, it is basically when an experience happens to a person and it murders a part of their spirit. Like it makes them sad, it makes them feel less than. It can also cause like, you know, physical reactions, right? Because if I'm stressed, because in this situation, I was told that because I'm a Black woman that wears my hair like this, I can't possibly know anything about engineering, you know, and I have 4 engineering degrees, I might start questioning myself just because I was told that by like a supervisor, for instance. And if that starts to kill my spirit, then all of a sudden, like now I'm extremely stressed, I'm anxious, and all of a sudden that's manifesting in my body. And my body's starting to, you know, fail. I might start having migraines or anything like that. So it's really just I would call it the twofold method of like even like the microaggressions, the macroaggressions, and then it's like that thing, the incident that actually happens, plus what it actually does to us like as a whole, and how it actually influences. And it's kind of like death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah. Thanks so much for providing that clarity for
Can I,
all of us.
can I
So,
add something there?
yeah, please, you know.
So I think the creativity and what Fantasy was doing, and obviously I'm biased, right? Because I've been watching Fantasy before she was even thinking about these things and was one of her research participants, right? So there's a lot that I could say here. But I think the creativity piece of it that was most important for me was in how she gathered the story, right? Because she could have just done interviews about how spirit murdered we felt. But because she knew that that was a traumatic thing, she gave us the space to like make
Mhm.
art of that. And that in and of itself and being creative in how you're surfacing problems and how you're surfacing conversations created a whole nother thing, right? And then one other piece I want to surface is that she also did a bunch of raps as a response to her, to what we gave her. And for me, you know, as a poet, I value the creativity requires to make stuff rhyme and still make sense. But also there was a certain level of like healing that happened that we were all able to experience. And even though you know, I haven't necessarily met all of the other research participants, it did create a sense of community and a sense of camaraderie because there was a lot of vulnerability required in order to be that creative, right? So I think creativity's ability to surface problems in a way that's a little less traumatizing is really key, but also its ability to create community is also really key from what Fantasy did there. Not that you didn't say that, girl, because you was there, but I just wanted to highlight that again for people because I think we often miss that, right? We think creativity is just cute and fun, but it serves a purpose and has a function.
Yeah, so something that I notice in the work that you described and having watched, I got to watch half of your dissertation, then I had to teach a workshop, or I got to teach a workshop. But this sort of notion of like, there's a boldness for you to have done what academia calls an alternative dissertation. It takes a lot of courage. Admittedly, I tried to do an alternative one, but was like sort of shepherded back into no, just write the paper and do a normal presentation. And so, but what you took was a lot of courage to step outside the sort of box and normative sort of expectations of a student. Um, And so I think that there's something really powerful in the sort of notion of creativity and the boldness it takes to experiment. Now, from a scientific sort of definition, we define experimentation as like a research method in which one or more variables is consciously manipulated, or and the outcome or effect of that manipulation on other variables is observed. So by when I think about some of the experimentation I did as an engineer for Texas Instruments, I was sort of manipulating those variables. But what you introduced and how you created your study, and some of the things I've noticed Chanel do in her work as well, is this sort of creative experimentation, and how that is just as valuable and powerful than the scientific method, right? And how using creativity to experiment is again connects back to this sort of humanizing aspect that is really an underlying aspect to all of the work that each one of us do. So for the next question, my next question is, how do you approach the challenge of balancing those creative ideas with the, I'm going to put in air quotes here, practicalities of experimentation in STEM, right? So when we think of like what's expected in STEM, whether that's in industry, whether that's in higher ed, whether that's in for young STEM learners, what would you suggest here? I'm going to lob this one to the audience, to the panel, and to see who's got the first response to that.
I guess I'll respond. Well, I am responding, so it's not even a guess, right? Because I'm here. And so how do you approach that challenge? It's tough. And I think you mentioned this before. You have to have a boldness, also a vulnerability. So the two actually lie, like they're situated right next to each other, but one doesn't necessarily always overtake the other, right? They are working in tandem. So you have to have that vulnerability to say, this is what I'm going to do. I think this is what I'm going to do. I think this is going to work out right. You may like it, you may not, but the boldness is, regardless if you like it, this is what I'm going to do. And so for me, as an evaluator, I have been met with so much opposition in the ways in which I do evaluations. Like I take like the basic parts of it, like let's just say collective impact, and not to bore anybody with it, but it's like a standard. But instead of just having those 5 areas, I'll add shifts of beliefs and thoughts. I'll add, okay, so how is the culture changing because I am in the space? Things of that nature. I'll add reflective journals. Not what you did, fantasy, because I think that's just like yeah, that's a whole different thing. That's a whole different thing. I'm not even there. I'm just battling with people just to do reflective journals. I had one client here recently that told me that the people wouldn't participate. And what you get from collective journals versus an interview, you have that participant has the time and the space to write whatever it is they deem they want to write. I have another client, they do audio diaries. And you'd be amazed at what people just walking around will say about whatever it is that we're studying. And so that boldness to say, this is what I want to do, but that also that vulnerability to say, okay, it may or may not work out right, is kind of where I live. But because I am a scientist and there's a part of me that's still, I don't know, just trained that way, I do go and look at the journals and see who's used what for what. And if it works for this framework, might it not work for this one? So I'm always questioning the best way to do something and then going back and saying, okay, well, this worked. So now I can be even bolder. So when this client is like, no, it won't work, I'm like, yeah, it's going to work. And we're going to try it this way. We're going to try it for a year. But I can guarantee after this year, you're going to say, Pamela, we're just going to go ahead and do it this way.
Yeah, I like that. Chanel, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I love what you're saying about the boldness. And, I think a lot of our role, especially as, anybody who identifies as creative or who just has a different way of thinking, a lot of our role is to, like you were talking about, being the reagent, right? Our role is to be that catalyst, and sometimes that boldness is just moving forward. What I found in my work is my boldness is to show and tell, right? So I can tell you that it will work, but also let me show you, right? So I've had a lot of clients who it's just interesting, especially people who are doing work for social good. It's interesting the way that we haze ourselves and the way that we come up with constraints. So they'll have these ideas and they're like, oh, this won't work, and it just falls flat in the meeting. My job, or my self-appointed job, is to push past that with examples, right? So it's hard for people to ideate in conversation, but once people have something to edit and disagree with, you'd be surprised how many of those constraints change, right? So we'll have a conversation about doing something creative and people are like, I just don't know if we can, the logistics of this and how much that would cost. Well, let me just make a proposal. Let me just make the budget, right? And I've recently had a client where we were thinking about just how much to compensate people. And then a lot of times, compensating people well is being creative, right? That's like being controversial, right? And people are like, I don't know if we can do that. And usually we only do that. Let me just run the numbers right quick and show you that we're still under budget, right? Let me let you see it as opposed to like having you have to agree with it or having you have to come up with the model. So a lot of times my creativity is really just like giving people an example and something to disagree with so that the idea can live, right? I'm giving life to this thing. I'm making the bullet points, making the outline, highlighting the things that are important, and then we can be creative together, as opposed to like requiring you to agree with the way I think, requiring you to be okay with like what I just said. Let me boldly show you this is how this thing will work. And also sometimes it's just doing it anyway, right? So we might not have budget for it. We might not completely agree about it, but I know it's not going to take much to collect that data. If I'm wrong, I never bring it up. If I'm right, I get to be like, hey guys, remember that thing we decided not to do? Well, I did it, and it's actually quite helpful, right? You obviously need to be careful with like consent forms and those type of things, but like there are ways to just it's the doing of it. It's not the talking about it. It's not the agreeing about it. It's also for you, you don't really have to be sure, right? It's creativity, it's experimentation.
Yeah, thanks. Pamela, what's coming up for you?
I just wanted to add one thing. I love that, Chanel. And one of the things when you said you put it out there and people are like, I always ask the question, but if we could, what would that look like? And then the room just goes silent. But then you can see the people processing. And then you ask the question, then I ask the question again, but if we could do it this way, what would it look like for you? And that's when I kind of put my creativity on the people in the room and they start coming up with ideas. So no longer is it a shutdown. It's really like just a session of brainstorming. And I think that works. That has worked in my benefit.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pamela. So I think you both kind of answered this a little bit in your responses to the last question, but I think that particularly from an industry perspective, there's always a desire to measure this. Like, how do we measure it? How do we measure it? It doesn't matter if we can't measure something about it. So what are some examples to either Chanel or Pamela, who just answered the last question, or to Fantasy and Joanna? What are some examples of ways that we can measure our creativity and experimental ventures within our fields or professions?
So there's a lot of ways. One thing that I've loved is keeping conventional metrics and then allowing the intervention to change. Because in a lot of ways, that proves to senior leadership that there's something about what's happening that's interesting, right? So usually when I'm doing something creative, I try my best to, as much as possible, not change the metric. Like, let's do something different and then see what we hear, see what shifts. And surprisingly, usually there's some large uptick, and that triggers for senior leadership that, hey, let me go ask some questions about what was happening here, right? So especially in cases where I wasn't able to get the buy-in about doing something creative, but I know what I'm doing is creative, I'll just use the same metrics they were using last year, and then they're going to notice something is different, right? But that doesn't necessarily give you the data about how well the creative intervention changed, right? Usually you have especially if you've been doing research for a minute, you have a gut about where the change will occur. And I usually just try to put as many touch points as I can with the clients or with participants at that place, right? So I might not know exactly what survey questions to ask, but I do know at what point something interesting might be happening. So then there are more recorders over there, there are more reflections over there. And also I'm prepared to, like, as quickly as possible, translate what I'm seeing there. Especially with things that are about people's lives and people's lived experience. The metric is going to be qualitative, right? So you're going to need time in the research plan to translate what you're seeing qualitatively into some numbers, right? So that's like, I did a bunch of reflections. I very quickly, sometimes I just do it in ChatGPT if privacy allows, to see what themes are there, and then I'll give you the frequency of those themes, right? And that's a way that we can measure it. But it doesn't always have to be like perfectly done quantitatively. If anything, you want to think about the culture of the organization you're engaging with and what's important to them, right? Are they the people who need a good PowerPoint? They need some statistics. Okay, well then how can you represent what change you saw qualitatively in a language that they can appreciate? But also, like I said, sometimes the educator in me likes to let people discover that thing, right? So I know you're going to assess the situation in this way. I'm going to do something different, and then it's going to come up through your channels, and you're going to come asking me what I did and how I did it differently. And especially in these large organizations, sometimes I found that to be the most effective, right? Because you can't really change what they're measuring and how they're measuring things, especially if it's tied up in like legal things. But you can put yourself on their radar by letting their systems work for you and letting their systems require them to come talk to you about what's happened.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Chanel. So I also want to clarify for our audience, some of the things that you're describing are also like human-centered design, user-centered design. These are things that we don't always think about when it comes to creativity. We just think about what are the widgets that we're making. But in many cases, the widgets don't get made until we've involved the best widgets haven't been made unless we talk to humans first and engage them in the process. And there are there's a whole field of study around human-centered design and user-centered design and UX and user experience and things like that. And that is what helps, I think, in many cases, really bolster the creativity. And so there are, again, so many metrics and ways that we could engage people. I think, again, something that we all share in common is this sort of underlying value around inclusion and equity. And so there becomes also a truth to like, how are we caring for the people that we're serving? And Fantasy talked about that with her dissertation study, that, she didn't just ask people to relive their trauma for the sake of her study. She gave them sort of space and outlets for that expression, in sort of in service of the study. And so we have to be really careful about that. So I'm going to combine the last two questions to the audience, to the panelists, and then I'm going to start filtering through. I think we've got a lot of questions on the Slido, so I want to make sure that we get to answer some of those. So the last couple of questions I had for you all were around students, right? And advice for students. So in what ways can young STEM professionals cultivate a mindset that's conducive to creativity and experimentation? And then paired with that, just what advice would you give students who might fear that their ideas are too outside the box for the traditional STEM fields? So I'm going to let you all as a panel answer that, and then I'm going to start looking at the questions so we can get those queued up. So I think, Fantasy, go ahead. Why don't you start us off?
Yes, so I would say, first and foremost, I think starting with the mindset that every idea is a good idea. I mean, whether it's a success, whether it's a lesson, or whether you need to reinvent it, it's still a good idea. So don't be afraid to take that initiative, to try it, and don't be afraid to fail. But also, if you are afraid, just know that that's normal. Like, I was scared when I got ready to do an arts-based dissertation in engineering. Like, I was terrified because I have, for those of you who don't know, I have 4 engineering degrees. So to me, it was like I fought so hard to get an engineering identity as a Black woman. So for me to actually tap into my creative side and include that, it was a very difficult tension for me initially, because I think because of the way that I fought for that identity. So in that process, I had to partner with my fear. So you have to partner with your fear. Like, write down what it is that you fear. Ask yourself. I always ask myself 5 whys. Anytime I have a question, I feel like I don't really understand why I'm afraid or why anything, I ask myself 5 whys until I get something that's a bit tangible. Okay. And then once I get that tangible thing, I create strategies. I'm an industrial and systems engineer by trade, y'all. So I then create strategies to be like, okay, so this is a tangible fear that I have. Here are some counter affirmations that I could say whenever I feel this thing. And then here are some strategies or things that I could do that will help me to feel that way and to actually live that affirmation. And then, track your progress. I know a lot of us are in STEM or in fields where we need to measure return on investment or whatever, seal into people. So track your progress. And honestly, when you track your progress, you'll realize that a lot of the things that you were fearing were worth you taking that fear and fueling it to actually do the idea and stuff that you had. So that's my advice.
Can go on next.
Chanel? Yeah.
So yeah, fear was definitely going to be the major piece of what I address is partnering with your fear. I think fantasy is a great way to put that. My biggest suggestion would be to experiment. And experimentation doesn't necessarily have to be, once you have a big project or a big contract or money, right? Sometimes experimentation is just saying it out loud. Finding community that you can practice things out loud with and just get creative. My biggest piece of advice would be to never stop talking about what your ideas are, because you never know when you're going to find the fertile ground for that. And even the people who are not your allies and people who don't necessarily help, those conversations still are helpful, right? Because in those moments, you're practicing what it means to face rejection, what it means to face people not agreeing, and you're developing the skill set to be able to push through. But for me, most of my success, especially in like the creative things I've done, comes from me just telling people what my ideas are, even when they're babies, even when I don't have anything written down about it, even when it's just something I want to do. Because once you find your community, they need to know what you're interested in so those opportunities can find you back, and I think for a lot of us, especially those of us who are in STEM fields and have, some marginalized identity, it takes us a minute to find that community, but the community is only going to find you based on how much you wave your hands, right? So the more that you're like, hey, I want to do this, I'm interested in this, people will start sending you stuff and people will start giving you what you need. Because I think a lot of times, especially in a STEM place, because the tracks are so well defined, whenever we want to do something else, we think we have to define these tracks. And the thing is, that track is not natural for you. It's not natural for any of us if we want to get to the root of it, thinking about indigenous cultures and the way we're supposed to be existing. But for those of us who are creative, that pathway won't exist, so it's going to be lonely, it's going to be scary, it's going to be wrought with trial and error. And also every step you take is you figuring that thing out. So you're going to need community to help you kind of figure out what that next step is. So don't be afraid of fear. Be ready to experiment, but also wave your hands as much as possible as you have an idea so that you can find your community. And lastly, I would just say, don't be surprised if that community comes in different places in different ways, right? By design, they're going to be things that you didn't expect and things that you wouldn't think. And a lot of times it won't be things that you sought out, right? So I can't tell you how many connections have come to me through people that I might not have liked, right? Like that person actually didn't vibe with me, but they connected me with somebody who was perfect for, and that became a 10-year kind of thing. So watching the bridges you burn, but also being okay if there's somebody that you don't get along with, that doesn't quite get it, because that person can still be a stepping stone or a connection to a person who will get it.
Yeah, I want to connect something you said, Chanel, with the panel that we have in next week, which is on persistence. It reminded me of an experience I had as an engineer for Texas Instruments. Is when I was continuing my master's thesis work once I was fully employed, I had this out of the box idea that nobody on my team wanted to fund, because I wanted to study this, further study the permeation and diffusion of moisture into the headspace of the digital micromirror device, right? But I couldn't get the funding for it. So I started shopping it around at different teams. And so until I could find a pocket of money within the business group that said, okay, I'll fund this, right? And I remember this because it's my lucky number, but I had shopped that idea around to 7 different teams of meetings until somebody offered to fund it. And then it was Megan, the baby engineer, trying to create this true experimentation study, right? And I was able to disclose a patent. I don't know what happened to that because I ended up leaving the organization before it came to fruition. But again, overcoming that fear and really learning to speak up for yourself, right? So sometimes your ideas are not things that people want to hear, especially if you're somebody from a marginalized population. And sometimes we have to say it 10 times or, to get the opportunity to have that. And again, connecting to something Fantasy said, she talked about, she has 4 engineering degrees. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think I know you well enough to sort of connect a dot here of saying like, but yet you still didn't sort of feel the identity. And that what I want to draw a sort of exclamation point on that here for people who are like, what do you mean you didn't feel like an engineer after that? And that's because people who are from traditionally marginalized and excluded populations within these fields, we could have all the degrees, we could have all the accolades, but to really internalize that identity as somebody who holds that profession is challenging as a result of external oppression that has told us we don't belong in a space. And so that's the work that we get to do as educators and leaders to begin to help people truly to build those identities and to reduce the barriers that they face that can affect their identity formation. And so for the people who are participating through the Bossier Parish community, we've got tons of resources for you on the Center in Teaching and Learning, which is who's hosting this, to help you begin to address those barriers. So I think, Joanna, you wanted to answer this question, but I want to plant a few seeds here for the final questions. Fantasy, people would like for you to do a wrap for us. So you have the option to do it or not do it. But I want to give you a few minutes space to pull something together if you want to do that for the audience. We've got a couple of upvotes on that. We've got 3 upvotes. And so, Joanna, I think you wanted to respond to this question, and then we'll go, I'll pull up some questions from the audience.
Thank you. I just want to respond to the aspect of students. What if you're worried your ideas are too out of the box? And just some of these responses, like, people will look at you funny, right? You will get all the like, what? And they're, so that meeting what seems like the reality and then keeping on going, the persistence is that interesting balance, because there still is an assumption of what is some kind of core or canon, and so-called excellent ideas follow right along out of that. And so you do have to deal with that and overcome that. And so I love hearing the ideas about, here's how you meet fear, or just, okay, this many people looked at you sideways, until somebody said, oh, I get it, I can hook into that. And one example I have that was wonderful was working in a marine biological research lab for 4 years. And then I decided to do my PhD with a wonderful mentor who would ask me about once a month, hey, I really want to set you up for what you want to do next, and have you be prepared. And so how can I do that? And so this very brilliant person in fluid mechanics would forget every month, like, wait, what is it about, like, people in science? Like, what's your deal? So I would get to say it again. So it was a really wonderful mix of, like, this person is in my corner, this person is cheering for me, and this person doesn't get it, what I love. So I'll say it again. And yeah, just that mix. And I'll mention briefly, it's not the only thing out there, but there's a 2020 paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the diversity innovation paradox in science, that underrepresented scientists are innovating at a higher rate than dominant culture majority students, and are not seeing the rewards in the academic system. So that whole, like, not getting bogged down in how it is right now, and knowing, as everybody knows, they experience it every day, of like, there's a lot of speed bumps to get over. There's a lot of things to say, like, we're going to do this differently, and I can see it, and getting, I really like what Chanel said about the communities, and you didn't know where they'd come from, and like, well, today my community is not my dissertation committee, but tomorrow it might be, or there's the person who gets it, or so just that, keep on working it, because it's not just gonna fall into place necessarily with, like, got it, I see you, I welcome you, your idea, so the work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joanna. All right, so first question from the audience is, how do you balance creativity with your analytical and often perfectionist side? I feel like okay, Chanel's got it, okay.
That's the struggle. I think if you're going to really be about this life, I would let go of the concept of balance. To me, the most important piece is harmony, because you don't want equal parts of both. Like, the engineer in you wants to balance, but like, who's that good for, right? If you have equal creativity, equal innovation, there's no paper that says there's a certain percentage of which that's optimal. For me, what I've been going for is harmony, right? And making sure that like I'm able to, so one, I'm only taking projects that allow me to flow in different parts of my brain. And that took a while for me to understand that that was an important criteria for like accepting projects and jobs. But also and this might sound a little capitalist or like selfish and transactional. You also get to determine when you bring your creativity to the table. Um, I no longer work at Ford, so I can confidently say I didn't let them use me as a creative because in my head they weren't paying me for that. So I was doing things creatively, but I also had to put a boundary on how much of my creative energy they were tapping into because, and for me at least, I want my creativity to be something that my community can experience, right? And if I let my creativity get worn out in these capitalistic spaces, I won't have much to offer, right? So I was thinking creatively as much as I could, but I wasn't trying to balance that at work, right? I wanted my work to be done well. I wanted it to be innovative, but it didn't need to exhaust me creatively. So for me, it's been more important to have harmony, right? To make sure that I feel comfortable deciding which, I don't want to say part of my brain because we all know that it's not how the brain works, but which part of myself that I'm leveraging, because trying to get balance will kill you, right? It's like a tightrope and, you're really never technically at balance. You just have muscle engaged and you're trying to like hold on, right? So letting yourself be harmonious and, bringing in things that adjust in time to me is the best approach. Because if you're trying to like wear this hat of like, I'm the creative engineer, you're going to get worn out at some point because they are different approaches and different ways of thinking. But if you get good at knowing when it's time for which one, then you become super valuable, right? Because you're able to take different hats on and off.
Excellent. So the sort of last question I want to offer that kind of combines a few is how did you all use creativity to shape your career trajectory and to get you where you are today? And then if Fantasy wants to lead us in a wrap, she can close us in that. So how did creativity shape your career trajectory and get you where you are today?
Well, for me, because I did so many different things, because I was creative and I was interested in different things, and I think that's part of being creative as well. Your interest is just not, it's not laser focused all the time. Like there's some days you want to do this, and some days you want to do that. And so, because I was always interested in doing multiple of things, I can bring all those to the table as an evaluator. So I have a STEM background. I've served as a PI. I've been on it as an NSF reviewer. I've lobbied for money, for STEM education. So I can bring all those things. I love my community. I do things in the community. So I think just being able to harness all those different experiences because of my love for different things, then I'm able to bring those to my current self and be okay with it being my current self. So when people look at my CV, the first thing they always say, and it's a little snippy, oh, you've done so much. You've got so many different interests. And I say, yes, I do. And I can all bring them together and serve your organization. So it helps me to understand who I am as a person and what I can bring to the table. And I never, if it's something I want to do, I just go for it.
I have a quick response. The question was how accepting things based on how they make you feel. Hindsight will make the story make sense. So don't feel like you need to be able to completely understand exactly how this fits into your brand or your expertise. Hindsight is 2020. Hindsight will take care of that. You don't have to have the perfect words to describe why you're figuring stuff out. At the end of the year, you'd be like, oh crap, I'm a such and such now. Like that's to me, I've had no choice because the things I'm interested in send me in different places. So let hindsight do its thing.
Any other career advice? So I'll add to that. Someone asked, what would you tell a young person who's looking into your professional field? And we'll say looking into STEM as a profession. Joanna?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of back to the creativity or the out of the box, and I really like Chanel's word harmonious. Like there are ways where take in constructive feedback that feels good, like constructive feedback, right? So still, I'll think about me as a graduate student. Still, graduate students are going to have giant ideas that are like, and then I'm going to do everything. And it's helpful for advisors to like, you're going to do one thing that you do by yourself because those are the rules. So it's going to wind up being about this big. And it's a bummer to be like, oh, here's my little bite-sized thing that I can actually do in 6 years. Still takes, you need the feedback of here's how we do it. And then just that gut check of like, I'm getting squished too small or I'm not getting hurt. So some sort of back and forth of like, I'm not allowed to be free to do it all. And like, that's right. Because folks are giving you decades of experience of like, you're never going to get done so there's some back and forth of like, that's advice that helps me move forward. And that's advice that doesn't. That's advice about looking for somebody else who's not me right in front of them. So how does that boil down into actual advice? Which just that gut check on like, these folks are helping me pare it down or wonder, shall I take it this way or not for my benefit? Or nope, this doesn't feel like benefit. So that back and forth.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joanna. I want to highlight what Pamela added in the chat, and I fully agree. Pamela says, be open to where it can take you. Don't allow anyone else to determine your pathway. Enjoy your journey. And I think I'll add to that is that creativity, when you look at your career from a creative standpoint. So Chanel mentioned being laid off. I've been laid off. Those were really hard pivots in our career trajectory that we didn't anticipate. And so creativity allows you to sort of envision a brighter, a different future that leverages, like Pamela said, all the amazing diversity of experiences. And so I encourage you to use that sort of same creativity to map out the kind of future that you want. So with that, I'm going to give the last minute to Fantasy to close us out with an original rap, maybe. And again, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope that you'll join us again next week. We're going to have another panel next week. So check out the website to make sure that you can register. We encourage you to invite everyone to attend. So next week, we're talking about resilience and innovation, embracing failure and perseverance in STEM. And so you'll notice that there's lots of similarities with the things that we talked about today. And we, again, have a really great lineup of professionals who are going to be our speakers, including somebody who's fresh out of college as well, and just starting her career at Lockheed Martin, Mary Long from Tetra Tech, Chauncey Lundy, one of my colleagues from Texas Instruments, and then Julie Thine from Dow. And so I hope that you'll join us. So Fantasy, the floor is yours.
All right, so this is actually called Put Some Respect on My Name. I'm her. This was actually my first rap in this test. So I won't actually say it with the music because we don't have time, but this is kind of like an affirmation to y'all as you're, learning how to be creative in your own respective fields. So it's just honoring who you are. So trust and believe me when I say I'm her. All of my accolades, both personal and professional, concur. And all I ask is that y'all put some respect on my name and stand for that equity and inclusion that y'all claim. So put some respect on my name. I'm her. Top recruit of my class, #1. I'm her. Been a grown ass woman getting a bag. I'm her. You try to play me like a simp and that's sad, cause I'm her. So remember who do your publications and run all your meetings, of late conducting your research while you're at home and you're sleeping, and you won't let me advance because you know that I'm seasoned, but I'm going to tell you one thing now. I'm #1 for a reason. So I'm an expert in many ways, got knowledge for days. My dual epistemologies read through all of your plays. I can't deny what I feel. You can't deny what is real. I had engineering experience before this entire ordeal. I do your research and mine's, professionalism combined, connections out the wazoo, and my wisdom ages like wine. But you can't get through your head the value that comes from my lead, the way I handle my business, so you gaslight me instead. So worked on your grants for some years, mentored most of my peers, advanced your tenure and careers, and interest in my progress disappears. So understand where I'm coming from and know that my victory's already been won. And if you mad that your darkness didn't succumb, just know that my reign of terror has just begun.
Oh, yes. Oh, Fantasy, thank you so much for sharing your story and your
welcome.
gift with us and that lyric. So I want to thank all of my panelists. What you all may not know is they're all my friends. Um, and we all have stories that we our journeys have meshed together at some point in our life. So Chanel, Fantasy, Pamela, and Joanna, thank you so much for joining us today, for telling us your experiences and your stories. I encourage all of you to go to the website and follow them on LinkedIn, so that you can continue to learn from them. With that, I will see you all next week for the next panel on perseverance and persistence. Take care, and until next week. Bye, y'all.